It's the country at the center of international news. But as a previous Soviet republic, where did Ukraine come from, and how did it become independent? Ukraine's history goes back to the Middle Ages, when its capital Kiev was founded during the time of the Khazar state. The Khazars were a semi-nomadic Turkish people who quickly became one of the wealthiest empires of the early medieval Europe. Situated right between Eastern Europe and Southwest Asia, Khazaria had every major land trade route passing through its land. For 3 centuries, the Khazars were one of the most important players in trade between Europe, China, and the Middle East. In 882, Kiev was conquered by the Varangian noble Ola, signaling the end of the Khazar rule. Eventually, though, Kiev rose from the ashes as the center of the Slavic states of the Kievan Rus. The name Ukraine, however, would not appear in historical documents until the 12th century and formally started appearing on maps in the 16th century. Infighting led to the collapse of the Kievan Rus state starting in the 12th century, just as the nation of Russia began to be formed. Kiev and the lands comprising modern Ukraine were sacked by various Rus factions and Cuman and Mongol raids both. Conflicts with the Mongols heated up in the 14th century after their attacks on Europe, with Poland and Lithuania fighting to keep the Mongols out of the eastern flank of Europe. Around this time, Ukraine came under the control of Poland and Lithuania. Poland, though, was an oppressive ruler, and Ukrainians revolted against Polish rule in 1490. At the same time, the Mongolian Golden Horde began to seriously decline and splinter into different factions, leading to the establishment of the Crimean Khanate, which would get wealthy off the trade of Russian and Ukrainian slaves to the Ottoman Empire and beyond until the 1700s. In 1569, after the formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Ukraine fell under Polish administration and officially became a part of the Polish kingdom. Poles immediately set about colonizing the massive territory, resulting in many new cities and villages being founded. However, the Poles denied autonomy to the growing Cossacks, and in 1648, Ukrainian Cossacks led a massive rebellion against the Polish. Beset by foes on all sides, though, the Ottoman Turks to the south, the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania to the west, and the Tsardom of Muscovy to the east, the Cossacks were forced to sign a treaty of protection with Russia in 1654. In 1667, the Polish-Russian Treaty of Andrusovo divided Ukraine between Poland and Russia. Russia granted the Cossacks official autonomy in what is today central Ukraine, though they remained under Russian protection. Gradually, though, this protection became rule, and the Cossacks now found themselves rebelling against the Russians. By the late 18th century, though, any further rebellion was prevented by Russia wiping out many Cossacks in a massive slaughter. Central Ukraine was now firmly under the rule of the Russian Tsars. What grip the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had on Ukraine collapsed after the Commonwealth's defeat at the hands of the Russian forces in 1772. The Commonwealth would go on to suffer a further 2 defeats, leading to the partition of Poland and Lithuania over 3 separate events. The 2 nations would disappear for 123 years, and formerly Polish territory in Ukraine was seized by the Russians, with an extreme western slice of the nation held by the Austrians. Ukraine was now almost entirely part of the Russian Empire. Ukrainians, however, desired for their own nation-state, leading to a movement amongst Ukrainian intellectuals and artists known as Ukrainophilism. Russia responded by banning the use of the native Ukrainian language and enacting policies of Russification and Pan-Slavism sought to erase the Ukrainian national identity. Many Ukrainians fled to the western part of the country where Russia's influence was weaker, but efforts to unite Ukrainians in the east with the Russian people were far more successful. With the arrival of World War I, though, things would get very tumultuous for Ukraine. In February 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully kicked the Russian Tsar out of power, leading to the end of the Russian Empire and a birth of what would become the Soviet Union. In the chaos of the collapse of the empire, Ukrainian nationalists attempted to secure their own independence. However, different factions refused to work together, leading to the rise of several movements seeking an independent state. Inevitably, these factions were overpowered by the Soviet Union, which retook control of most of Ukraine. What remained in the west was split between Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Ukrainians, however, still wished for independence, and to subdue them, Joseph Stalin engineered an artificial famine that would kill millions. Known as Holodomor, the famine lasted for a year, and while general famine also affected the rest of the Soviet Union, in Ukraine it killed as many as 10 million Ukrainians. It would be recognized as genocide by Ukraine and 15 other nations in 2006, though Stalin rebuffed any allegations that the starvation was being artificially made worse on purpose. When World War II rolled around and the German army launched an invasion of the Soviet Union, many Ukrainians saw initially the German army as liberators from the oppressive Soviet rule. Others, however, formed a guerrilla resistance against the occupiers, with different factions motivated by allegiance to the Soviet Union or a desire for independence. The Ukrainian insurgent army would fight against both Soviet and German forces in an attempt to create an independent Ukraine, and they'd continue operating against both the Soviets and the Poles until the 1950s. After World War II, the Soviet Union regained control over Ukraine, but as the UN was formed, granted Ukraine a degree of autonomy. This allowed Ukraine to be an independent subject of international law while still remaining part of the Soviet Union, and was done in agreement with the United States so that the newly formed United Nations wouldn't be so heavily skewed toward the West. However, Ukraine's autonomy was in lip service only, as the republic was fully under the control of the USSR. In 1954, the Russian Soviet Republic agreed to transfer the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a move that would spark war 60 years later. The Ukrainian nationalists never stopped fighting for independence, but were never able to shake off the Soviet rule. However, with the collapse of the Soviet state in 1991, Ukraine became an independent nation with a proclamation of independence on August 24, 1991. On December 1st, following Soviet law, a referendum saw 90% of Ukrainian citizens voting for independence, and the Soviet Union granted their wish. Ukraine might have become an independent nation, but as the new millennium turned, a rejuvenated Russia sought to reclaim its influence across the former Soviet republics. Russia's new president, Vladimir Putin, attempted to infiltrate Ukrainian politics so as to subvert its independence without armed intervention, resulting in the election of a pro-Moscow president, Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych immediately reversed course for Ukraine, as the nation had previously been moving toward closer ties with Europe and had ambitions to join NATO. For its part, NATO had deferred the decision of Ukrainian membership, effectively kicking the can down the road for fear of antagonizing Russia. After the alliance expanded into Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, Russia warned that any further expansion toward its borders would be provocation to war. Yet Russian belligerence only led to its many neighbors seeking even more protection from the failed democratic state, wishing to join the protection afforded by NATO. In November 2013, President Yanukovych refused to sign the Ukrainian-European Union Association Agreement. The agreement was a step toward EU membership, with it providing for the establishment of common laws and regulations across a broad range of governance, including equal rights for workers, visa-free movement of people within the Union and its partners, and access to the European Investment Bank. Not only did the agreement promise to rejuvenate Ukraine financially, but it would also make it more difficult for Russia to interfere in its internal politics. Upon becoming a full-blown member of the EU, any such interference would have been seen as a hostile act against the entire Union, prompting appropriate retaliatory responses. For Vladimir Putin, this was unacceptable, and thus he ordered Yanukovych to tear up the agreement, with Ukraine instead signing a trade agreement with Russia. Protests immediately sprang up across the country, with Yanukovych being seen as a traitor. The protest prompted the Revolution of Dignity, and protests that began on November 21, 2013, lasted all the way until mid-February 2014. The situation momentarily calmed until February 18th, when the government sent riot police against the protesters, resulting in the deaths of 82 people and 1,100 injuries. The clash only further fueled the protesters, which began occupying government buildings. On February 21st, President Yanukovych was forced to sign an agreement with opposition leaders that would restore power to the parliament and call for an early election in December of that year. This, however, was not good enough, and the protests continued, resulting in Parliament voting 328-0 for the removal of Yanukovych, and new presidential elections on May 25th. A warrant for Yanukovych's arrest was promptly issued, though by then the former president had already fled to Russia. Russia, meanwhile, made the best of the situation. If it couldn't control all of Ukraine, it would settle for breaking it off piece by piece. Russian forces annexed the Crimean Peninsula on March 2014, claiming the people had asked to rejoin the Russian nation. However, a referendum on annexation showed that the majority were in opposition to annexation. Russia didn't stop there, though, and began funneling money and supplies to pro-separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. In April of 2014, separatists announced the creation of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, holding public referendums which the separatists claimed resulted in 90% of the population voting for independence. These figures were never independently verified. Ukrainian national forces immediately began a battle to reclaim control of the separatist regions. However, the separatists were not just receiving supplies and money from Russia, but were often fighting alongside regular Russian troops. Russia denied international allegations that it was providing direct armed support to the separatists, despite independent investigators proving that Russian troops were present in Ukraine through social media tracking. Russian soldiers operating in Ukraine quickly got the name Little Green Men for their insignia-less uniforms but clearly Russian equipment that they carried. Ukraine would continue to fight against the separatists as it sought once more to draw closer to the EU. In 2019, the Ukrainian constitution was amended with the strategic goal of entering into both the European Union and NATO being enshrined within the preamble of the Basic Law, and 3 different articles and transitional provisions. Now Ukraine's wish to join the West was part of Ukrainian law and not subject to interference by Russia in its politics. This was a line too far for Vladimir Putin, and with his separatist movements not escalating across eastern Ukraine as he wished, in 2022 he launched an invasion of Ukraine. What happens next remains to be seen. The invasion has so far been disastrous for Russia, which operated on the very foolish assumption that most of Ukraine would see the Russian army as liberators. Instead of being greeted with flowers on the streets, though, the occupying Russian army had been greeted with Kalashnikovs and Javelin anti-tank missiles. Even in eastern Ukraine, which holds the greatest pro-Russian population, Russian troops are seen as invaders. Resistance has been incredibly stiff, backed up by hundreds of millions in military aid provided by the United States and the European Union. Despite its incredibly poor performance so far, though, the Russian army is almost certainly going to win the battle for Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian people have proven they have no wish to be dragged back into the Russian fold, where they've spent most of their history. Should Russia decide to fully occupy Ukraine, it'll be stuck with an insurrection movement that will last as long as Russian forces remain, a strategic quagmire that will consume the Russian economy and the lives of thousands of its soldiers. If Russia instead opts to topple President Volodymyr Zelensky's government and replace it with a Moscow stooge, any move to alter Ukraine's present course of joining both EU and NATO will require a rewriting of the constitution, resulting once more in revolt. To be perfectly fair, all outlooks for Russia are bad in Ukraine, as the Ukrainian people are determined to never lose their hard-won independence again. Now go check out what will actually happen if Russia invades Ukraine, or click this other video instead.